In the previous video, we looked at Sebastian Gardner's attempt to explain the Copernican Revolution. And in order to do that, Gardner presented the problem of reality, right? The question of how we can know that our cognitive powers fit reality, right? Will allow us to grasp, understand, and know reality. Now, I think that presenting the problem of reality in order to understand the Copernican turn is great. I mean, that's precisely the right move. That is really enlightening. But I think that the way that Gardner then ends up explaining the Copernican turn is at the very least misleading. So what Gardner tells us is that Kant makes an absolute distinction between, on the one hand, being real and on the other hand, being an object for us, right? The kind of thing that we know. So Kant makes an absolute distinction between the real and objecthood, where objecthood is to be understood in terms of knowledge. If that is true, right, if that is what Kant does, that would be a disaster, in my opinion. I think that that would sort of get Kant into precisely the kind of problems that he wants to avoid. In fact, it would make him a defender of precisely the position that he wants to attack. So let me try to explain that to you. Okay, so as you undoubtedly know, Kant calls his own philosophy transcendental idealism, right? And this stands over to transcendental realism. So that is, transcendental realism is the position that Kant wants to attack. So what is transcendental realism? Well, I think one way to understand transcendental realism, one way to define it, is to say that the transcendental realist believes that reality, that the real, is what it is independently of us. Specifically, independently of our ways of knowing, independently of our cognitive powers. Right? So transcendental realism is the idea that reality is what it is independently of our cognitive powers. And so if you are a transcendental realist, then the problem of reality is going to be a serious problem. Because reality is there and it's independent of my cognitive powers, and there's here my cognitive powers, but I've defined this in terms of independence from that, so how am I going to bring them together again? Right? How am I ever going to do that? And it's not easy to see how that is possible. And so if we look at the philosophers before Kant, we can see two sort of very broad strategies in 17th and 18th century philosophy, which are known as rationalism and empiricism. And Kant's basic idea is that rationalism and empiricism both fail. Right? So the rationalist ploy is generally to claim that we can know through pure reason alone that there is something that bridges this gap. Right? This gap between A and B, even though A and B are completely independent of each other. And really the only entity, the only thing that could sort of bridge this gap is going to turn out to be God. And so we find in Descartes, we find in Spinoza, we find in Leibniz, always God as sort of at the central place in the metaphysics, because it's really through a sort of innate or rational knowledge of God that our ability to know the world has to be secured. And Kant thinks that this doesn't work, in part because he thinks that all these proofs of the existence of God are terrible, as we will see much, much later on in the critique. But possibly, I mean, I guess in a sense this sort of presupposes a solution to the problem of reality rather than giving one, right? I mean, if we believe that our cognitive powers are good enough, are adequate to know God, we are already believing that, we are already assuming that our cognitive powers can grasp the real, in fact, the most real, namely God. So this doesn't really work. The empiricist solution tends to go into the direction of saying that what we know are our ideas, our impressions, our sensory impressions, or whatever any particular philosopher would like to call them, and that we don't really know anything about the objects that generate those impressions. Maybe we don't even know whether they exist. Kant definitely believes that there is a sort of skeptical tendency here in empiricism, where the empiricist, who says that the object of knowledge is, something purely subjective, is led into a skepticism about reality. And that is why Kant is going to end up claiming that the transcendental realist, so the person who believes that reality is what it is independently of us, ends up being what Kant calls an empirical idealist. Somebody who thinks that the objects of our empirical knowledge are merely ideal, right? They're only in our minds. They're not, like, objectively real. And Kant is going to claim that his own transcendental idealism, which doesn't think of reality as that which is independent of us and our ways of knowing, that his transcendental idealism is the only philosophy that is going to allow us to be empirical realists. So people who actually have a realistic attitude towards the objects of our empirical knowledge, believing them to be real, believing them to be the objective, real thing. Okay, so what I'm suggesting here is that, Kant's most basic thing, most basic move, is to deny precisely the claim that reality is what it is independently of us. That is, he denies precisely what Gardner says he affirms, namely an absolute distinction between, on the one hand, reality, and on the other hand, well, basically us, right? The knowable. So I don't think that's the right way to understand Kant. And here's a way to sort of strengthen that conviction. If that is what Kant does, right? If Kant's basic move is to make an absolute distinction between the real on the one hand and what we can know on the other hand, then he loses the game before it starts, right? Then Kant doesn't really answer the question of reality at all. He just gives it up. He just says, oh yeah, we are not in touch with reality. We're in touch with this other thing. We're in touch with objects. What are objects? Well, objects, I'm going to define them in terms of being knowable. I'm going to define them in terms of our ability to be in touch with them. And look, now I can know that we are in touch with them because they are the intouchable. Okay, no pun intended. So that is really not an answer to the question of reality. In fact, it's a situation where the skeptic just wins, right? Kant claims that it is the great scandal of philosophy that philosophers haven't been able to prove the existence of the external world. But on this reading, Kant is basically just saying, yeah, the skeptic is right. And in fact, Gardner's own phrase, the way that Gardner phrases it, he phrases it in terms of Kant saying, yeah, the skeptic is kind of right. The skeptic is right that we can't know the real in the strongest sense. But then Gardner adds that Kant's idea is that we can know the real in a weaker sense, namely as these knowable objects. But if the distinction between the real and the knowable is absolute, as Gardner himself has suggested, then it just doesn't make any sense to talk about the more real and the less real. That is precisely, you don't have gradations if there is an absolute distinction. And if there is no absolute distinction, then Kant isn't making the move. And anyway, the whole distinction between more and less real seems super problematic. So, I don't think that Kant can't be going this way, right? Kant seems to, if Kant is very often understood in this way, right? As somebody who says, okay, we can't know the really real, we can only know the objects as they appear to us. Let's define them in terms of, the fact that they appear to us, that we can know them. We can at least know something about that. Well, it makes it really dubious whether there's any knowledge involved there at all. If there's any knowledge involved in there at all, it's something merely subjective, something that doesn't have any objective status. It is not the kind of thing Kant is after, and it is definitely not an answer to the Cartesian skeptic or the Humean skeptic or really to any kind of skeptic at all. What it would be is Kant saying to the skeptic, hey, you are right, but we philosophers have this nice little garden of knowable objects that we are going to talk about now. Okay, that is, if that is what Kant is doing in the Critique of Pure Reason, you should stop watching these videos right now because it's not going to be a very interesting book. Luckily, that is not what Kant is saying in the Critique of Pure Reason, and you can continue watching these videos. So, I would say that it is a disaster to interpret Kant as making an absolute distinction between the real and being an object for us. Where do we go from there? Well, here's maybe another way to sort of approach the same problem, to approach the Copernican revolution. Kant himself, and Gardner goes along with that, which is totally understandable, presents the Copernican revolution in terms of a sort of reversal, right? If it's not the object that has to conform to our cognition, it's not our cognition that has to conform to the object, it's the object that has to conform to our cognition, right? It's like there's a little arrow that gets switched around. And one way to think about that, and this is probably not the right way to think about it, but it's a way of thinking about it that I think comes very naturally, is to think of it a little bit as a sort of causal arrow, right? As it's not that the object causes us to have like adequate ideas of it, but it is our forms of knowledge that somehow cause the object to be known or be knowable, or at least have a certain form or structure that we can know in advance, right? It's like as if the causal relation is not going from the object to the subject, from the subject to the object. That is a very natural way of reading these phrases about the Copernican revolution. But in many ways, that is not a very helpful reading. And one way to see that it's not a very helpful reading is to see that it doesn't really help us solve the problem of reality. Right? The problem of reality is a problem of how we can achieve, or how we can know, that there is a fit between our cognitive powers and the objects of our cognition. Between the cognitive powers and the reality that we want to know. And so that is a question about fit. Like, how do we know that A and B fit together? If just having a sort of a causal relation between object and subject doesn't prove that there is a fit, and I think Gardner and Kant are absolutely right in suggesting that it doesn't prove that there's going to be a fit, then how would reversing the arrow prove it? Right? How would reversing the arrow prove that there is a fit? If an arrow in one direction is not enough to prove a fit between object and cognition, how would an arrow in the other direction prove that there is a fit between object and cognition? So the only way for such a reversal to make sense is if there is some other asymmetry somewhere in our picture of cognition, or our picture of the real, or our picture of our relation to the real, some other asymmetry that makes this reversal relevant. And I think we can see a need for that by looking at the real Copernicus himself. So let's take not the claim that Kant is talking about, the claim that the Earth revolves every 24 hours, but the claim that the Earth goes around the Sun, right? Which is the other famous claim of Copernicus. It's the Earth that goes around the Sun, not the Sun that goes around the Earth. What difference does it make, right? If I say the Earth goes around the Sun rather than the other way around, what difference does that make? Well, the answer is it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference at all to anything you're going to see, to the way that you're going to do physics. It's in a sense irrelevant. There has to be something else in the system. There has to be some other asymmetry in the system that makes this difference, that turns this difference into something that is relevant. And so what I would say is that the really relevant thing that Copernicus does is not so much that he says that it's the Earth that goes around the Sun, rather than the Sun going around the Earth. It's that he says that all the other planets move around the Sun, rather than moving around the Earth. Right? That is what changes the system. What changes the system is not merely switching the Earth and the Sun, which doesn't make any visible difference. If you keep all else the same, what makes the difference in the Copernican system is that Copernicus takes all the planets and makes them revolve around the Sun rather than around the Earth. And that generates a totally different astronomical system. And if you want to know more about that, you should check out the version of sort of the geocentric version of Copernicus system that was developed by Tycho Brahe a little after Copernicus. Okay, so what I was trying to say is this, right? If it is in any sense relevant to us, that it is not our cognition that has to conform to the object, but the object that has to conform to the cognition, then there must be some asymmetry, some difference between objects and cognition somewhere in the system that is going to make this reversal relevant. And I think there are some sort of obvious options that are not the right options. And then there is maybe, in a sense, a less obvious option that is the right option. But it requires us to understand the Copernican revolution in a slightly different way. So here is one way that one way we might try to understand the Copernican revolution. Right? We might think that, what we ought to be doing, what Kant's move is, and this is basically the move that I've been criticizing in the first half of this video, what we ought to be doing, what Kant does, is he cuts objects loose from reality. And once you cut objects loose from reality, understood as, what is real independent of what we think or what we believe, then there no longer are any independent standards of rightness. Right? Our thinking must be adequate to the objects because the objects are just defined in terms of how we think about them. Right? There's no independent standard of being right or being wrong. And that would be what Kant means when he puts forward this Copernican analogy. That is definitely a totally wrong way of understanding Kant, right? It must be a wrong way of understanding Kant because it basically doesn't make any sense. If there are no standards of rightness, if there are no standards of adequacy, then it doesn't make any sense to talk about knowledge either. Right? Knowledge requires standards of rightness, standards of adequacy. If Kant ends up saying something like, whatever way you think about it, that's the way that the objects are, and so whatever way you think about it, that's right. I mean, that would be terrible. That's not what Kant says, but if he were to say it, that would be terrible. Okay, so that's really not how we have to understand the Copernican revolution. So here is another, a bit more sophisticated way of trying to understand it. What we want, what Kant is going to end up being really interested in, is a priori knowledge about the objects, right? A priori knowledge about the world. We want to know things about the world without having to rely on experience. Now, if this a priori knowledge has to come from the objects, that would be impossible, right? Because we can only experience the objects. The objects are only given to us in experience. So the a priori knowledge has to come from our mind. So what the way to think about this is we first understand our mind, we get a priori knowledge about that, and then because our mind is going to shape those objects, is going to export that a priori stuff into the objects, we can know in advance that they are going to conform to that. And that is why a priori knowledge about the objects is possible. So we need the Copernican revolution. We need the objects to conform to cognition, because that's the only way that a priori structures could be exported into the objects. A priori means that it comes from our cognition and it must be transported into the objects. And that can only be done if the object conforms to our ways of knowing. In a sense, this is right. But in the sense that I've just been describing it, it can't be right. It can't be right because there is nothing in the story that I've just been telling that solves the problem of reality. Right? That solves the problem of how we can know that our cognition is adequate or fits reality. Right? The standard way of doing that doesn't work because the idea that reality somehow impinges, somehow has an influence on our cognition doesn't prove that our representations of reality are going to be right or correct. But if we have just some other kind of causal relation, if somehow our mind affects the objects, then we also don't have any proof that the object is going to conform to whatever the mind is trying to put onto it. Right? How do we know that the objects are the correct material for our a priori stuff? Right? How does that work? How do we know that the objects are going to conform to our mind? Right? We don't just need to know something about our own minds or our own ways of cognition in order to have a priori knowledge about the objects. We also need to know that the objects will actually conform to those structures. Okay, so what I'm saying is this. Any kind of sort of naively causal reading of this Copernican revolution, it's not the object that sort of influences us, it's we who influence the object, has to be wrong. What we need in order to solve the problem of reality is indeed some kind of a priori knowledge. What we need is an a priori knowledge about the fit between object and subject, about the fit between objects and our ways of cognition. That a priori knowledge has got to start in our own cognition, right? We have to start thinking as thinking. We think. That's this activity that we're doing, right? That's the starting point. But where this starting point has to bring us is not to some naive picture of, oh, you know, we have the mind and it's gonna influence the objects in a certain way, because then how do we know that the objects will let themselves be influenced? What we need is this critique of pure reason, this self-understanding of reason. What we needed to reveal to us is an a priori fit between subject and object. We need to see, we need to understand a sort of relationship, a sort of harmonious relationship that exists between object and subject, between our ways of cognition and the objects of that cognition. And that is what Kant's Copernican revolution is going to have to do. So there is a sort of reversal. I mean, we don't want to start with the world, we do want to start with thinking, but we have to understand this in a subtle way, right? What this attempt of reason to understand itself has to show is not that we sort of somehow like create the object or form it or I don't know, in a sense that suggests that there is some material out there that we are now trying to influence. That can't be the right picture. It has to give us an a priori picture about our relation to the world that solves the problem of reality. And how Kant is going to do that is, of course, going to be one of the main questions going forward. And it's a question that's going to occupy us more or less throughout the analytic, certainly in the transcendental aesthetic and in the transcendental deduction.